Russia faces a heavy price for limited gains in Ukraine war, death toll estimates suggest. By International Desk. Date. Use current date when publishing. More than 3 years into the war in Ukraine, mounting evidence suggests that Russia is paying an extraordinarily high price for relatively limited territorial and strategic gains. New death toll estimates from Western intelligence agencies, independent research groups, and open-source analysts indicate that Russian military casualties have reached levels unseen in Europe since the Second World War, raising serious questions about the long-term sustainability of Moscow's war effort. While Russia continues to claim progress on the battlefield and frames the conflict as an existential struggle against the West, analysts argue that the human, economic, and geopolitical costs are far outweighing the benefits. Despite massive mobilization efforts and a wartime economic pivot, the Kremlin's objectives remain only partially fulfilled, and in some areas, increasingly out of reach. A war of attrition with enormous human cost. Since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the conflict has evolved into a grinding war of attrition. Initial expectations of a swift victory gave way to prolonged fighting marked by artillery duels, drone warfare, trench combat, and urban destruction. According to recent estimates by Western defense officials and independent demographers, Russian military deaths may now exceed 300,000, with total casualties, including wounded, missing, and captured, potentially approaching or surpassing 700,000. These figures remain contested, as Moscow has not released comprehensive casualty data since the early months of the invasion, but multiple sources converge on the conclusion that losses are severe and accelerating. Ukraine, too, has suffered deeply, with tens of thousands of soldiers killed and many more wounded. However, analysts note a critical difference. Ukraine is fighting a defensive war on its own territory, while Russia is absorbing losses far from home, for gains that are increasingly difficult to justify to its population. Limited territorial gains despite massive losses. Despite the scale of Russia's military commitment, territorial gains over the past 2 years have been incremental. After early advances and subsequent retreats in regions such as Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Kherson, Russian forces have focused primarily on eastern Ukraine, particularly Donetsk and Luhansk. Even there, progress has been slow and costly. Entire towns and villages have changed hands only after months of intense fighting, often reduced to rubble in the process. Military analysts estimate that in some offensives, Russia has lost dozens of soldiers for every square kilometer captured. These are not decisive breakthroughs, said one European defense analyst. They are extremely expensive, attritional advances that do not fundamentally alter the strategic balance. Mobilization and the strain on Russian society. To sustain the war effort, Russia has repeatedly expanded recruitment through a mix of partial mobilization, financial incentives, prison recruitment, and regional conscription drives. While these measures have helped replenish frontline units, they have also placed growing strain on Russian society. Reports from within Russia suggest that poorer regions and ethnic minority areas have borne a disproportionate share of the losses. This imbalance has fueled quiet resentment and raised concerns about long-term social stability. Families of fallen soldiers often receive limited information about the circumstances of death, and compensation payments vary widely. In some cases, bodies are returned months later, or not at all, leaving relatives in limbo. Economic costs mount despite wartime adaptation. Economically, Russia has shown resilience in the face of sweeping Western sanctions, thanks in part to high energy revenues, trade rerouting, and increased state spending. However, economists warn that this resilience masks deeper structural damage. The war has redirected vast resources toward the military-industrial complex, crowding out investment in healthcare, education, and civilian infrastructure. Inflation remains a persistent problem, and labor shortages have worsened as hundreds of thousands of working-age men are sent to the front. Defense spending now accounts for a historically high share of the national budget, limiting Moscow's ability to address domestic needs. Over time, analysts argue, this could undermine economic growth and public confidence. Battlefield tactics and high casualty rates. One reason for Russia's heavy losses lies in its battlefield tactics. In several phases of the war, Russian forces have relied on mass infantry assaults, sometimes referred to by analysts as human wave tactics, particularly in heavily fortified areas. These assaults, often supported by artillery but lacking adequate air cover or coordination, have resulted in devastating casualty rates. While Russia has adapted by increasing drone usage and electronic warfare capabilities, these changes have not fully offset the human cost. At the same time, Ukraine's growing proficiency with Western-supplied weapons, precision strikes, and intelligence sharing has increased the lethality of the battlefield for Russian troops. The psychological toll on soldiers and veterans. Beyond physical casualties, the psychological toll of the war is becoming increasingly evident. Russian veterans returning from Ukraine report high rates of trauma, depression, and difficulty reintegrating into civilian life. Support systems for veterans are limited, and mental health services remain underdeveloped. Analysts warn that untreated psychological trauma could have long-term consequences for Russian society, including increased crime, domestic violence, and substance abuse. Political implications for the Kremlin. Politically, President Vladimir Putin has maintained tight control over the narrative, using state media to emphasize resilience, patriotism, and alleged Western hostility. Open criticism of the war remains risky, and dissent is swiftly suppressed. However, experts caution that casualty numbers on this scale are difficult to conceal indefinitely. As losses mount and economic pressures persist, the Kremlin may face growing challenges in maintaining public support, particularly among younger generations. So far, the Russian leadership has shown little willingness to alter its core objectives. But some analysts believe that internal debates over strategy and costs are intensifying behind closed doors. International standing and strategic setbacks. On the global stage, the war has significantly altered Russia's position. While Moscow has strengthened ties with countries such as China, Iran, and North Korea, it has become increasingly isolated from much of Europe and North America. NATO has expanded, adding new members in response to the invasion, an outcome directly opposite to one of Russia's stated security goals. European countries have also accelerated defense spending and reduced dependence on Russian energy. These are long-term strategic losses, said a former diplomat. Even if Russia holds some territory, the broader geopolitical environment has shifted against it. Ukraine's resolve in the war's uncertain endgame. Despite immense suffering, Ukraine continues to resist, bolstered by Western military and financial support. Kyiv insists that it will not accept a settlement that legitimizes territorial conquest, while Moscow maintains that the annexed regions are non-negotiable. This deadlock suggests that the war could continue for years, with both sides seeking to outlast the other. For Russia, however, the question remains whether the current trajectory, high casualties for limited gains, is sustainable. A heavy price with no clear victory. As death toll estimates continue to rise, the contrast between Russia's sacrifices and its achievements becomes increasingly stark. The war has reshaped Europe's security landscape, drained Russian manpower, and imposed lasting economic and social costs. While the Kremlin may still believe that time is on its side, analysts warn that wars of attrition rarely favor the attacker, especially when objectives are ambiguous and resistance remains strong. For now, Russia faces a sobering reality. A conflict intended to project power and secure influence has instead exposed vulnerabilities, strained resources, and exacted a human toll that will be felt for generations.